could have dinner with any three people, living or dead, who would they be? This is always a fun question to consider. In every edition of our church's newsletter and the Spotlight feature, two of our church members get to answer this question. And Jesus is often one of the three people at the table. But let me ask you this instead. If you could have breakfast with any three people, who would you choose? Hey everyone, hope you're doing well today. So, if you could have breakfast with any three people, who would you pick? An interesting question to consider for sure. In our passage today, we will find several of the disciples with the opportunity to have breakfast with Jesus. So, a pretty interesting post resurrection story. We'll get into that in just a minute. I wanted to take a second just to set up the story and give you some context. We'll be reading in John 21, verses 1 through 14. And this takes place at least 1 week after the resurrection. So by this point, Jesus has appeared. He is alive and risen. He's appeared to several people, the disciples a few times, some of the women, Cleopas and his friend on the road to Emmaus. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago. He has just appeared to Thomas. Remember, Thomas doubted and said, unless I see Jesus and touch his scars and put my hand in the wound in his side, I will not believe. And Jesus shows up for Thomas. So all of that has just happened, but the resurrection and the implications of that are still very fresh. So the Passover festival is over. That was a week-long festival. The disciples have returned from Jerusalem back to the region of Galilee. So the disciples find themselves in a strange place emotionally. They are caught in between being joyful about the fact that Jesus is alive, yet still unsure about what that means for them moving forward. So they have this tension of joy and relief mixed with uncertainty and doubt and hesitancy about what to do next. Similar to what many of us are experiencing as we are in quarantine, not knowing what the future holds, what things will look like a month down the road or even several months down the road. We just have to take it a day at a time, just like the disciples were doing. And in the midst of all this uncertainty, the disciples return to what they know, fishing. Remember, many of those men were fishermen before Jesus called them to be disciples. So at the very beginning of our passage today, we find that they are fishing on the Sea of Tiberias, which we know better as the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus fed the 5,000 and did many of his teachings and miracles. And the disciples were fishing at night, which was common practice in that day. The night was much cooler than the day, and the fish caught during the night could be sold that morning in the market. So with that said, let's take a look at our passage together, John 21, verses 1 through 14. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, We'll go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, Children, you have no fish, have you? They answered him, No. He said to them, Well, cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, It is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and he jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, Bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. Though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, Come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and he took the bread and gave it to them, and he did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. There are so many interesting details to this story that we could talk about. The fact that the disciples fished all night long, didn't catch anything, but yet with just one command from Jesus, they were able to catch so many fish that they weren't able to bring them all in, and their net was completely full. We could talk about how Jesus is setting Peter up to restore him after Peter doubted or denied Jesus 3 times before the crucifixion. We could talk about the number of fish, 153, and if that represents something. Scholars and theologians have long tried to discern whether that is symbolic. We could talk about how this was the third time that Jesus has appeared resurrected to the disciples, and we know that 3 is a highly symbolic number throughout the Bible. All these interesting details and dynamics of this story. But today, I want us to just focus on 2 simple details of this story that I feel like the Lord may want us to hear and be reminded of today. And the first is Peter's eagerness and zeal in this story. Throughout the Gospels, we see that Peter is perhaps the boldest disciple, always willing to put himself out there in order to grow closer to Jesus, to figure out more about Jesus. Remember, Peter is the one, when the disciples are in the middle of a raging storm on the sea, who says to Jesus, "Call me out to walk on the water to you." While the waves are still raging and the wind's still blowing, Peter's the one who, before any of the other disciples say so, Peter has the courage to confess his belief that Jesus is indeed the promised Messiah, and Jesus blesses him for that. Peter even tries to stop Jesus from going to Jerusalem when Jesus predicts his death earlier in the Gospels. And in that situation, Peter's a little overzealous, and Jesus has to correct him and rein him in a little bit. So here, it's no surprise that when John points to the shore and says, "That's Jesus, that's the Lord," Peter immediately loses sight of everything else. He gets tunnel vision. He literally jumps out of the boat and swims frantically to Jesus. And while the other disciples, it says that they were only about 100 yards offshore, it would have just taken another minute or two to row to shore. Peter couldn't wait that long. He immediately had to get to Jesus. So he jumps out of the boat and swims, which is a comical thing in a way, but remarkable how passionate Peter was to see Jesus. The second detail that I'd like us to be mindful of today is the simple fact that Jesus sits down and has breakfast with the disciples. This is a detail that may seem insignificant, that we would just normally glaze over, but I so appreciate the fact that this is a part of the story. Jesus could have just stood on the shore, waved them in, and talked to them, and done what he needed to do. But instead, he chose to cook breakfast, to sit down, to light a fire, have bread, have fish, and to commune with them. And it's just a good reminder that food is so much more than just sustenance to give us energy and strength for the day. Food is powerful because it brings us together. It helps us to gather with one another and share life together. And hopefully during this quarantine period, you've had the opportunity to gather around a table with your immediate family, at least, if not maybe digitally. And hopefully, when this quarantine period is over, you can have the opportunity to go out to eat and gather around a table, and catch up with family and friends. But food has such a powerful way of doing that. And I think it's intentional that Jesus chose to have breakfast with his disciples and to share with them. So, the 2 thoughts that I would like to leave for us today are in the form of questions. And the first is, what would it look like if we had Peter's eagerness to spend time with Jesus every day? What if we woke up eager to commune with Jesus and to experience Christ's presence just like Peter did? Of course, I want to acknowledge that every day that will not always be the case. Some days we will be tired and exhausted, mentally drained, spiritually in a difficult place, and we won't feel that eagerness. But I hope that we can cling to Peter's example of always striving, always wearing our heart on our sleeve spiritually, so to speak, in order to connect with Jesus as imperfectly as we might, in order to know Him more, to love Him more, and to be loved by Him. And the second question pairs with the first. What would it look like if every day you had breakfast with Jesus? Uh, Depending on what your schedule looks like, perhaps morning isn't a good time. But what if you had afternoon coffee or evening tea with Jesus? The idea being every day committing some part of your time to sit down, to be very intentional to protect that time in order to spend it with Jesus and to commune with Him and to grow spiritually and to be loved by Him. I think about a quote from, I believe it was Mother Teresa, when someone asked her what she did in prayer. Her response was, I just allow myself to be loved. What would it look like for you to carve out time every day to allow yourself to be loved by Jesus, to focus on that, to meditate on that, to talk with Him? I tell the youth all the time, I ask them to think of their best friend, and then I ask them, how much time have you spent with your best friend in order for them to be your best friend? And of course, the answer is hours, days, weeks, even. And the same is true for our relationship with Jesus. Relationships require time, require investment. And so, time with Jesus is necessary in order to know Jesus more and to be closer to Jesus. So, in the week ahead, how can you tap into Peter's eagerness to be with Jesus, to sit and spend time with Him? And perhaps what would it look like to have breakfast with Jesus? Maybe it's sitting on your front porch or in your backyard, admiring your garden or the wildlife nearby. Maybe it's listening to music, if connecting with Christ is helpful for you in that way. Maybe it's just sitting still and allowing yourself the freedom to not be busy every moment of every day. Whatever it is that you need, I hope that, like the disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee that day, you will give yourself the gift of spending time with Jesus over breakfast, over a cup of coffee or tea, and allow yourself to be loved by Him. May God bless you this week, and may you know that Jesus waits on the shore of your heart, just like He did for the disciples, and He is thrilled to see you swimming ashore to spend time with Him. Love and peace to you all today.